Assalamu alaikum. You're watching Views and News, and I'm Faisal Rehman live from our Islamabad studios. Today we'll be talking about the ongoing Russian-United States tensions. As we all know that the United States recently ordered to expel another 27 Russian diplomats. And if you look at it, since 2016, the number is around 100. And exactly that's what the Russians did. Now, again, the Russians believe that they have an acute shortage of diplomats inside America. Obviously, Russia is a big country, so the case is with the United States of America. But again, talking about the Ukrainian issue, there is tension going on. Annexation of Crimea perhaps is another very important reason where the Americans or perhaps the Western European countries do not agree. And then quite a lot has been happening as far as Syria is concerned. Again, there was, Syria was again the bone of contention. And wherever the Americans, in fact, showed their presence in the recent times, the Russians were there as well. Even if you talk about Afghanistan, there were reports earlier, and people used to think that that's not correct, but that was indeed absolutely correct. And the story was that Vladimir Putin was in contact with the Taliban. Imagine, way back when the regime of the former president of Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani, they were in power. So a lot has been happening. And obviously, the Cold War era, if you talk about late 50s, 60s, and then 70s, and then the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the kind of role the Americans played, perhaps, and whatever happened after that, disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991. And that was the time when the superpowers, when we used to equip them as equal, certainly we got to know that there was this financial crunch on the USSR. And eventually the Americans became the undoubted superpower, and they controlled the world, and they were in charge, and they were calling all these shots. But in the recent times again, now we talk about the Chinese as an adversary of the Americans. And China has become an economic giant, and they have challenged the Americans, not only in the South China Sea, even elsewhere as well. But now when you hear the American presidents, the moment they take charge and they say, or the Pentagon issues a statement, that we have got currently two major adversaries. One is Russia and one is China. Again, they blame the Russians for meddling in their elections, and they came out with the hacking issues also. And they said, well, the Russian hackers are also involved in many dubious activities. And then again, talking about the role of Kremlin in the Eastern European countries. A lot of countries are under the influence of the Russians. That is an absolute truth. You talk about Belarus, or you even talk about so many other neighboring countries. So this is what it is all about. Latest conference in Latvia again is something very important. But to talk further about it, before I introduce you to our panelists, our production team has prepared a report. Let's watch it.
Military and the political tensions between the United States and Russia are escalating with every passing day, and any escalatory move from either side can bring serious consequences for the world's peace. Recently, on 30th November 2021, the United States warned Russia of serious consequences if it launches an invasion of Ukraine. This warning was convened in the long-scheduled meeting of NATO's top diplomats in Latvia's capital Riga, as the United States and the allied countries showed their apprehensions regarding Moscow's incursion into Ukraine after massing tens of thousands of troops and heavy armor close to the frontier. In a press briefing during this meeting, the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg acclaimed and warned Russia that any future aggression against Ukraine would come at a high price and have serious political and economic consequences for Russia. Earlier, NATO Secretary General had warned Russia that NATO alliance members had different options to respond if Russia moved on to Ukraine. Moreover, the United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken asserted that any escalatory actions by Russia would be great concern to the United States, and any renewed aggression would trigger serious consequences. On the other hand, Russian President Vladimir Putin also warned the United States and Ukraine by criticizing their respective military exercises and other military moves, and claimed that such actions would be considered by Russia as crossing the red lines.
And now to talk about it, let me introduce you to our panelists. We have with us in our studio, on my right is Air Vice Marshal retired Ijaz Malik Saab, who is a senior analyst. Sir, thank you so much for your time. And we also have with us Dr. Naazir Saab, who is a senior columnist, senior journalist. Naazir Saab, pleasure to have you on the show. And on Skype from France, Paris, we have with us Karel, Vereycken, political analyst from Schiller Institute. Thank you so much for your time. Pleasure to have you on the show, sir. Now, Jalsa, first of all, sir, now whatever has been going on, I mean, there's not even a single area which we can particularly talk about, because there's multiple, platforms, I would say, where there are issues. You talk about the ongoing tension between the Russians and the Americans, sir. You talk about Syria. You talk about Afghanistan. You talk about JCPOA issue. You talk about the NATO in the backyard of the Russians and supported by the Americans, obviously, sir. And the Americans have told them to use at least 2% of their GDP to support the military aid. If you remember, during the time of Donald Trump, even when countries like Greece were in dire straits as far as economy is concerned, they were forced to buy Rafale planes from the French. So you talk about Ukraine, the huge number of troops that are gathering at the border, or you talk about the annexation of Crimea in 2016, sir. A lot of areas. But what we have noticed over a period of time, sir, ever since Vladimir Putin took charge, and was a brilliant man, I would say a very versatile man, sir, he means business. And he has put his foot down on every issue where the Americans tried to dominate the Russians. And this is what is happening, despite the fact that the Americans were able to put a lot of sanctions on the Russians. Now, sir, how do you see? Because at the end of the day, the Americans, as we all know, they have never fought a war outside or within their boundaries. Perhaps all the wars they have fought were outside the United States of America. Looking at the current change as far as the regime is concerned in Germany, sir, now Angela Merkel isn't there anymore. So she was somebody with lots of wisdom, I would say, sir. Or perhaps the neighboring Eastern European countries like Romania or Hungary or Latvia, Belarus, so on and so forth. So the influence of the Russians was there, is there, and perhaps will remain there. Now, engaging Ukraine, which is a huge country, sir, with the Americans and the Russians obviously do not want that to happen. Can this actually trigger something which would be eventually beyond the control of both these countries, sir? Because Vladimir Putin has very categorically mentioned that if somebody is going to cross the red line, we will retaliate.
Thank you very much. You have given a very candid intro, and the documentary prepared by your production team. It amply highlights what is the latest situation. But we just have to, see the very basics on ground. Russia, apart from a very brief period of a laid back economy and their own internal issues, Russia has been a superpower, and Russia radiates a lot of influence in the region and beyond the region, in fact. What Russia or Putin is trying to say, that please, hold on. It's not a unipolar world anymore. This is our backyard, and we call the shots here. And by amassing their forces along the Ukrainian border, I think Kremlin has given two messages. One is to Ukraine, which means a clear message that if you don't go by our dictates, we can take some physical measures, and which could be anything up to invasion beyond the eastern wing of the Ukrainian. Like they have done in the case of Crimean Peninsula. And secondly, I think the message is very clear to Americans that while they have been actively engaged with them in case of Iran or other global issues, but in this particular region, the message which goes to Americans loud and clear that hold on, we are here, and they, I think, want respect. They want their influence to be recognized in this region, and particularly I think with this new regime in America, they have a dual policy. On one side, unofficially track to diplomacy is on. They want to engage. They don't want to confront. As per their undeclared policy, they don't want to. There are visible indicators that they don't want to engage Russia. So they are engaging them, diplomatically in track to. And but at the same time, the sanctions which you have mentioned, obviously they would mean a lot for an economy like Russia. But to their good luck, even in the pandemic environment, Russia has done reasonably well. Inflation rising by 3 to 4%, but still the oil price globally, change in oil price, it helped them a lot. So I don't think so sanction will really deter them to, or they will be taking any backward step of American coercion. I think Russia would maintain its aggressive policy because it directly involves or boils down to their influence. And America has to think twice, because it's not only Russia, it is the containment of China which matters more for Americans. So with the natural alignment.
And they have mentioned both these countries as their adversaries.
Yes, they. They have been traditionally. The entire Cold War era, they have been on the brink of war a number of times. So, but I don't think so. It will go beyond that. It's my personal opinion.
It could be a diplomatic assault on the Russians from the Americans, but nothing more than that, or perhaps a few more sanctions.
This is my assessment.
Now coming to you, Naazir Saab, one important area. I mean, when the Russian president, who happens to be in power for a very long time, and who is going to be in power as long perhaps he is there, just like Mr. Xi Jinping, the Chinese always used to give very calculated statements. But now, sir, they say that, if you meddle in our issue regarding Taiwan, so it is just going to be something like, you're hitting your head on an iron wall. Straightforward statement that don't do that, don't even think about it. The Russians at the same time, say that if you'll cross this red line, then we will retaliate and we'll let you know. And this is what Russia has obviously done. Just imagine annexation of Crimea or the referendum there. Obviously, we do understand that there is a lot of Russians living out there. So the case is with Ukraine. But it's a massive number of troops on the border. Perhaps anything can happen. And the Russians earlier, they mean business. Now, sir, the importance of geopolitics in the region, sir. Because obviously, we always talk about geopolitics, geoeconomics, geostrategic issues. Obviously, sir, if Afghanistan is that important, Ukraine is very important. That is kind of a huge buffer zone between the Europeans and the Russians, sir.
The situation is definitely tense, but I don't think, responding to your question, that will it boil escalate to that level, escalate to that level. I don't think, because in the past, even when the Soviet Union was there and Cold War was at its height, now this tension is no match to, let's say, Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, yeah. But they went back from the brink. So they averted, and after that also there were multiple times when Soviet Union and America were on the verge of war, but they avoided it. So I don't think that this time also they will cross the red line. But the question then, if they are going to avoid the war, why this build up? Why? I think both America and Russia, both of them are responsible. First, let's talk about Russia. Russian sphere of influence after the collapse of the Soviet Union drastically declined in Eastern Europe, and not only Eastern Europe, the Eastern bloc like Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, all these, Czechoslovakia, all these were under Soviet influence, but they became part of European Union. Talking about the Soviet Union itself, there were 6 republics which became independent countries to the west of Moscow. And these were Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, 3 in on the Baltic coast, and then Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova. Interestingly, out of these 3 European former Soviet republics, only one is under, to some extent, Russian influence now. All others are out of Russian influence.
And that is Belarus.
And that is Belarus. And in Belarus also, Lukashenko has been ruling for 27 years now. In the 1990s, when Yeltsin was the president, he had good relationship with America. In fact, his second election in 1996 to a great extent depended on American help, because at that time Communist Party had once again become powerful. 1996 election in Russia. Anyway, after Putin appointed, Boris Yeltsin appointed Putin as president, Putin is a former KGB operative. Not head, but one of the senior operatives.
Also served in military?
Yes. So for the past 20 years, he has been ruling with an iron hand. Why did he occupy that small portion of Crimea?
Black Sea and
yes, but you know, it was part of Ukraine since 1956. In 1956, within the Soviet Union, the Soviet government decided that Crimea be given to Ukraine, and Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. So why suddenly, after that many years, after 60 years? Because Putin had already ruled for 15 years, his popularity was declining. He wanted, whenever I consider Putin as a leader, authoritarian and autocratic leader.
But don't you think that Crimea is also an area which is very important as far as your strategic concerns are?
It is important. And you are right that 60%.
I mean, look at the naval bases they have there.
Sea line of communication.
And 60% of the population in Crimea is Russian.
Yes.
25% is Ukrainian. So there were two purposes. One, of course, this strategic importance of Crimean Peninsula, but secondly, he also wanted to improve on his own declining popularity within Russia. Now, what has happened in the past 5 years, because of this constant conflict in Crimea, people of Russia have started looking to him as a strong iron man who can defend Russia. This is one. Now, why America and NATO are interested in that? American influence, because I directly related to if there is not going to be any war, why this escalation, and why I think America is blowing out of proportion this Russian hacking and Russian involvement in elections. I don't think that Russian hacking can influence American elections, but they are blowing it out of proportion. So that, if there is a constant tension, European Union is keeps its alliance with America, and this is a major source of America, of money also, supporting American military industrial complex. And the same is happening in China also, South China Sea, because there you have Japan and South Korea, and both of these countries pay huge money to America for their protection. If tension goes down either in Europe or in South China Sea,
it is going to indirectly benefit America.
Yes. So I connected with American military industrial complex, which constantly wants tension in one part or the other. Now, Islamophobia is, Islam is not playing that much role. They have used Islam for 20 years for their own purposes, saying that, kind of a bogey, that, this is the major threat. Now, this threat is not going to work anymore. So now they need two new fronts, no war, but a prolonged tension I foresee both in South China Sea and in Europe.
So this is going to be a continuous phenomenon now?
Yes.
Whether it's the Taiwan issue or it's the Ukrainian issue?
Yes.
Now, let's see what the gentleman sitting in Paris has to share with us. Now, Mr. Karel, a couple of points you have heard from our guests, Air Vice Marshal Ijaz Malik and Dr. Naazir Mahmood. But let's hear out from you. How do you analyze the situation? So the ongoing tension between these two giants.
Well, I think if you, I think I'm less optimistic than my two colleagues, analysts, because if you analyze it from a rational standpoint, I mean, nobody has interest in a world war. But history, several times, wars have started by errors of calculation, and entire countries have sleepwalked into conflicts which were absolutely not in their interest. So to understand what's going on, I think we should take a step back, because the main threat to world peace is the loss of mutual trust. I mean, if there is trust, there can be errors, but then it can be overcome and people can find a way to talk to each other. Since 1991, in reality, NATO has lost its raison d'être. It should have been disbanded. It has no reason to exist any longer since the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union was falling apart. That's the first point. Second, the West has betrayed its own commitments. If you go to the US archives on the discussions after 1991, there were explicit commitments of the United States, Britain, and other NATO countries not to extend NATO till the Russian borders. This commitment has been betrayed, which creates tensions. Then we have stations, ballistic missile defense weapons, which have dual purpose, which can be reconverted into offensive weapons. As an answer, we're back to an arms race where Russia and also China have been developing hypersonic weaponry to be able to face this threat. And now the West has been telling to Ukraine that at one point it should be part of NATO, which is completely unacceptable for Russia. Because if you, and this is now in a sense already happening, that the West is giving weapons, anti-tank weapons, and
Correct.
also Javelin, and also Stinger weapons to the Ukrainian army. And Russia has made it very clear that once you put missiles on Ukrainian territory, which require less than 7 minutes to reach Russia, that this would be the red line nobody should cross.
Correct.
So the urgency right now would be, first of all, for the West to make clear that Ukraine will never become a member of NATO. And second, that Biden should pick up his phone again and talk to Putin, and in an honest way say, okay, we're not going to push further these threats. So unfortunately, everything which is happening, like the shutdown of the mission of the Russian mission in Brussels at NATO, the expulsion of the Russian diplomats out of the United States, all this is breaking down the mutual trust and the channels of communication. So if we want to maintain peace, we absolutely have to find a way to reconstruct mutual trust. And this would mean mutual economic development around the rebuilding of Afghanistan, about the construction of Africa. We should engage in a common future where East and West can find a common ground and a perspective of peaceful coexistence and development.
Now, another important statement from the NATO that says that the Russian aggression would have a high price. I mean, on one answer, yes, the forces are accumulating on the border, and as you rightly mentioned, that this is exactly what is happening inside Ukraine. You're talking about the weapons that are being deployed. I mean, earlier there were issues in Poland regarding the defense shield, if you remember, the missile defense system that was deployed by the Americans. And, you know, there were a lot of issues where there were problems. But what I want to ask you is that Russians will not back out. This is what we have recently witnessed, that wherever they had to put their foot down, they had to make sure that their presence should be felt, they did that. Whether in Syria, or you talk about the Crimean referendum, right, wrong, or whatever, that's a separate issue at the end of the day. It's in their control. Or you talk about certain other areas wherever the, I would say, the Western or the NATO or the American pressure was put on the Russians. I mean, he retaliated. But over here, you seriously think that, I'm not talking about a major mega war or something. I'm talking about the border clashes, or perhaps the proxies that would start in the area. and so on and so forth. These are the concerns of the Russians also, sir.
Well, I think unless there is ethnic cleansing in Lugansk and the Donbass Oblast, I think unless if this happens, there will be a very strong reaction. So far, it's not happening, and also the winter conditions are very tough in this region.
Correct.
So I don't think. I think up till now, the 94,000 troops which are on the border with Ukraine, the Russian, these are military exercises. There's no invasion. They're just doing maneuvers on their own territory, which is completely legal. Obviously, it makes a point that, you know, that in case we are ready and we will not give up. So I think this only makes the case for opening up discussions and rebuilding mutual trust.
All right. Now, Avim Saab, what sort of military or kinetic operations do you think the Russians have, sir, in case of a border conflict? That seems to be there, sir. Because at the end of the day, what we have recently witnessed on the LAC, or even on regular basis on LOC with India, so there is this ongoing, firing incidents and, killing a few soldiers on the other side, few on this side. Now, do you think, sir, this is going to be a constant or continuous phenomena in that part also? Or do you believe that the aggression would be so strong that it could trigger into something else?
I think it will, if at all, it escalate, it will remain a low intensity conflict because talking about Ukraine is not even a member of a regular member of NATO. So under Article 5, NATO can only respond if a member country is invaded. So that is not applicable in this case. So at best, some of the European countries in their own capacity, they may like to intervene, but most probably it will remain below a certain threshold, and it will remain a low intensity conflict if at all. But I think it will transform sooner or later into a dialogue where Russia achieves its objectives, where they need a recognition in the region, where they need to be acknowledged, and Biden has shown inclinations that probably they would
talks would be the ultimate solution.
The military muscle will not be the option. It will be through dialogue.
But sir, when it comes to NATO, obviously you're talking about very strong European countries with full support of the Americans, and they were obviously, this NATO North Atlantic Treaty Organization was perhaps created because of the Russian influence, just to put a check on the influence of the Russians towards the western side of eastern side of Europe and the western side of the Russians. So now obviously when we talk about the regime change, that is what Americans always do in Middle East or other countries as well. So Russians have that kind of influence on certain areas, like meddling in the elections of the countries. This is going to be a constant problem then in the region. I mean, you don't need to use the kinetic means. I mean, soft power and smart power, I would say, is going to be the ultimate solution, isn't it?
Yes, this is fifth generation warfare era. So obviously, the soft power application is more pronounced in such conflicts. And I think American difference, America has been trying to impose regime change all over the globe. Whereas in case of Russia, they were in the contiguous regions that where previously they were part of Soviet Union or they were their close neighbors. So unlike America, I don't think so Russia has that kind of aggressive policy for regime change. Yes, in certain areas they have intervened to protect their allies again, but that was again triggered by Americans, and Russia came in later.
And how do you see this Chechnyan issues? Do you think the Americans are going to do something in that part also?
I think
just to pinch the Russians a little more.
Yeah, I mean, you have to bleed your enemy,
in any way possible.
In any way possible. We have an example of Siachen. It's the highest battleground in the world, and what are we doing to each other? What objectives India has achieved so far through Siachen? but they are trying to keep us engaged there. So probably that could be one option. You can't rule out.
Naazir Saab, if you remember, when a Russian jet was shot down by the Turkish Air Force and they used an F-16, a lot of tension developed between these two countries, Russia and Turkey, despite the fact that Turkey is a non-NATO member and pretty versatile in its decision making also, as long as we have witnessed Mr. Erdogan in power. Now the interesting part is that right after that, the Russians threatened them to renegotiate on the energy prices. They told them that our visitors are not going to go to Turkey, and imagine $10 billion worth of tourism just only through Russia. This is the kind of money the Turkish.
If I may add, 5.6 million tourists from Russia. This is the highest number for the Turkish economy.
Just imagine.
So it matters.
And sir, right after that, there was another very interesting phenomena, which we had never seen before. Certainly, bomb blasts in major cities in Turkey, and everybody was afraid. So this is the kind of Russian influence, even on a country which has the biggest military as far as NATO is concerned. Correct, sir?
Mm-hmm.
So this is what Russia can do. This is how. And obviously, whatever happened after that, you know, the Americans really had to put a check on the Turkish not to buy S-400s, and they said, okay, we will not supply you the engines of the helicopters you're building. And you know, obviously, the Americans know how to do arm twisting. So don't you think that was perhaps a message, not only for Turkey, for most of the NATO members also, that this is what, because you know, as far as energy is concerned, despite the fact that they're talking about LNG and all, but sir, Russia is the major supplier.
Exactly.
And those existing lines, I mean, you just can't rule that factor out.
And let me add to that related phenomenon. You know, after that deal, kind of a deal between Russia and Turkey.
When the presidents met.
When they met, there was also some tacit agreement about Azerbaijan and Armenia.
Yes.
You know, Azerbaijan is very close to Turkey because they are also people of Turkic origin.
Yes.
The Azerbaijani language is also very close to
see what
Turkish
happened
language.
During the war.
And previously, Russia was supporting Armenia, and Armenia had occupied Nagorno-Karabakh, and Nagorno-Karabakh remained under their
The
control.
Armenians for a very long time, till last year.
Yes, almost 30 years. Almost 30 years. And then Russia simply withdrew support from Armenia, and that was a green signal to Turkey, because Turkey supported Azerbaijan. And
openly,
all
the weapons were used,
and they were easily, you know, Azerbaijan was Armenia was easily defeated by, that was almost surrender. So that also shows that, you know, Putin can negotiate, and he knows probably where to assert pressure and where to withdraw. So I think it was a very good tactical move on his part to normalize, to some extent, normalize the relationship with Turkey.
Because so, Turkey itself, sir, forget about the economy of Turkey, that's doing great. But at the same time, sir, look at the kind of air force they have, look at the kind of mindset that prevails there, and the military presence. That is not a joke. Turkey, you can't take Turkey lightly, sir.
Yes, and you know, AVM Saab talked about this, you know, more than 5 million tourists going to Turkey. I remember when the Soviet Union collapsed 1991, there were so many tourists from Russia and Central Asian countries visiting Pakistani cities, especially Karachi and Lahore. Thousands of them. I was an eyewitness to all this. But then onwards, you know, as in our own country, extremism increased, and we tilted more towards more, you know, Pakistani society became less permissive, less and less permissive. And that reflected, and then these tourists, they moved away because they had probably nothing to do in Pakistan. And Turkey offers everything. So this is a lesson for Pakistan. We talk about tourism, but unless we change our policy and we have something to offer to tourists, they won't come.
It has to have a proper ecosystem. Just having a beautiful mountain doesn't mean that
doesn't mean anything.
Money.
Tourism is not a standalone product.
Exactly.
It is, you know, it has
a
package, your culture, your warmth. I asked one of the Russian, you know, participant, I was in a webinar, how come you don't have a language problem? He says, he asked 5 reasons, told me 5 reasons. One was enabling environment, as Dr. Saab has mentioned. He says we don't need to talk there. We are being provided by nature in the form of beaches and bright sun, sunlight to them, and all others, the integral parts of the global tourism, whatever they want. Turkey is open to those things. So that's why they are going to Turkey. Food, they love their food, and they can't speak their language. And I mean, language is not a barrier there, because as a package deal, they are promoting tourism.
But that's the way it should be.
But unfortunately, I remember, once there was a minister, that Maulana Saab,
Maulana Ataur Rehman,
he gave a statement that foreign tourists can come to Pakistan if they adhere to a Sharia kind of rules and
Sharia compliant tourism.
So obviously, then your mountain will remain as it is, as they have been for ages and decades.
I mean, yesterday, I was reading a very interesting story that the Chinese workers and the engineers are not happy because the mullahs in Balochistan, obviously there is a lot of influence of JUIF as well as Jamaat-e-Islami. So the wine shops, even the wine manufacturing units were shut down in Balochistan, who were providing certain basic alcoholic beverages to the Chinese. I think
we are deviating from the topic. Karel is deviating and he is wondering what we are talking about.
But obviously,
Karel?
talking about France, I think France is one of the top-notch tourism countries in the world, I would say. Paris most visited for sure. Now coming to you, sir, another important factor. Now when you talk about, let's deviate towards the South China Sea, sir. Again, the military planes and their jets, flying in that particular area, sir, giving a message to the Chinese. The Chinese are exactly doing the same. But as at the beginning of the program, I mentioned about 2 statements. One of Vladimir Putin that if the red line is crossed, military action would be taken. Military. Secondly, sir, when you talk about another great leader, Mr. Xi Jinping, he says that, meddling in the Taiwan affairs is equivalent to banging your head on an iron wall. I mean, strong statement, sir. And especially post the exit of the American forces from Afghanistan, sir, they have lost the credibility in one way or the other, whether we admit it or we don't, but this is a fact. Do you think now these 2 countries are actually posing a threat to the American hegemony in the entire area, not only in South China Sea, but otherwise also, sir? And also that the challenge the challenge or that threat is very much visible on the wall now.
No, I think it's completely exaggerated. First of all, I think we should not stay on the sidelines, but as media and as civil society, we should always be aware of disinformation. You remember Colin Powell speaking at the United Nations showing the so-called weapons of mass destruction.
I remember today, that night, sir.
Avril Haines has come to Europe, pretending that Russia was ready to invade Ukraine. The Europeans have asked her the proofs, and they say we don't have the proof, so far. So instead of, the Europeans especially should ask, and everybody should ask, if you accuse Russia preparing the invasion of Ukraine, just why don't you prove it first, instead of just saying it without any proof. Secondly, both Russia and China are not looking for world domination. They're just trying to recover from where they were before. They want to be respected. They want to not be in a century of humiliation, which was the case of China. And then the one China, 2 systems policy has been, again a breakdown of trust, because in the 1970s, the United States and the United Nations recognized mainland China as the only legitimate representative of China at the United Nations. So Taiwan, they have relations, they can give eventually some defensive weapons, but if you start recognizing parts of another country as a separate country, you're destroying the 5 principles of the post-world order of international law, which is national sovereignty and mutual respect. So this again, is a breakdown of trust, which in my sense, is a much bigger danger for world peace than the so-called threats posed by Russia and China, which they're defending their interests and they should continue to do so, but they are not threatening world peace or America or NATO.
Now, when Ned Price says that the United States of America is preparing for multiple contingencies, sir, what do you figure out from that kind of a statement?
I think I think the Russians are right when they say there is this illusion, NATO is trying to push Russia to a point where they so-called will make an error, which then they can be blamed of being the bad guys. And I think that's it's like playing with fire in a powder keg, it's a non-understanding that you always can push and push and push and go further, and that there's no limits to this expansionist vision. So I think it's very dangerous to continue this escalation, which is verbal for the moment, which can really sleepwalk us altogether into a very grave conflict. The other point in Ukraine is the internal collapse of the regime and of the economy of Ukraine. The COVID situation in Ukraine is absolutely terrible. The energy prices are extremely high. So this is also a bankrupt country, which will be tempted to look for external problems to have us forget its internal situation. So all of this should be dealt with if we want to calm down the situation.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Karel, for your participation in the show. Really, I'm grateful. And AVM Saab, thank you so much for your presence, sir. And Dr. Saab, it's always great to have you in the show. And that's all we have for this hour. I'll see you tomorrow at 8:05. Till then, you take good care. Khuda Hafiz.